Hey everyone, and thanks for jumping back into the Cryptoverse. Today, we're going to talk about Bitcoin. More specifically, we're going to be discussing the Bitcoin dominance. If you guys like the content, make sure you subscribe to the channel, give the video a thumbs up, and also check out the sale on Into the Cryptoverse Premium at intothecryptoverse.com. That sale will be ending by the end of the weekend. Let's go ahead and jump in. So, Bitcoin dominance has basically been stuck between 56 and a half to around 57.6, 57.7 for about the last month or so. So, I wanted to talk a little bit about what I think's going on, how we actually might see the end of the year play out as it relates to Bitcoin dominance. I will say it is my expectation that Bitcoin dominance will go down in 2025. However, in the short term, or maybe I should say in the medium term, over say the next like 3 to 4 months, I still am of the belief that it could go marginally higher. That does not mean that every cryptocurrency will go lower on its Bitcoin pair, but I do think there is reason to believe that Bitcoin dominance still could hit approximately 60%. Now, one of the things I have mentioned for a long time is that Bitcoin would reclaim market share for about 3 years. And one of the reasons that we've talked about this is, well, that's what's historically happened. I mean, that's exactly what happened last cycle is Bitcoin dominance went up for about 3 years. And then in 2017, we saw Bitcoin dominance go down. And in 2021, we saw Bitcoin dominance go down. So perhaps rather than try to overcomplicate everything, right? Instead of doing that, why don't we just say, all right, look, the last two post halving years, Bitcoin dominance went down. In the pre-halving year, in the halving year, and in the midterm year, we saw Bitcoin dominance go up. So instead of assuming this time is different, why don't we just assume it's the same? This is sort of the argument. Now, it also goes to the idea of monetary policy. As long as monetary policy is getting tighter and tighter, then the idea, generally speaking, is that people are going to flee higher risk assets for lower risk assets. So people would more likely convert their altcoins to Bitcoin, or if they're not doing that, the people that are more inclined to buy altcoins initially might start eventually buying Bitcoin because they just keep seeing Bitcoin outperform. It's a mistake to assume that altcoins always outperform Bitcoin in a bull market. They can often do that in a QE bull market with low rates and money printing, but in a quantitative tightening environment where you have high interest rates and the Fed lowering the assets on their balance sheet, generally speaking, you would expect Bitcoin dominance to go up. Now, where is dominance today, and how much higher could we realistically expect it to go? One of the things that I've pointed out a few times from last cycle is that, when Bitcoin dominance sort of started its collapse in, before 2017, at the end of it, it bounced from this level up to the 0.618 fib retracement. Now, once it passed the zero point 0.5 fib, that's what actually marked, if you want to call it, the mid-cycle top for Bitcoin in 2019, which is exactly where gold broke out. So if you were to also look at the same thing for this cycle, you can see that roughly it was when Bitcoin dominance passed the zero point 0.5 fib extension. That's where you could argue Bitcoin USD put in its quote unquote mid-cycle top. You see that? So you see how last cycle we saw Bitcoin dominance pass its zero point 0.5 fib extension. That's what marked the mid-cycle top in mid 2019. Same thing this cycle. When Bitcoin dominance passed the zero point 0.5 fib extension, that more or less marked the mid-cycle top within a few weeks, right? Within a few weeks. And then after that, Bitcoin dominance still trended higher to the 0.618 as Bitcoin USD was in the process of putting in lower highs. Now, we know that the following year, right, we saw Bitcoin go up a lot, but that was actually after QE returned in mass and after lower interest rates. So I think we're still in this process right now of seeing Bitcoin dominance go up. However, that doesn't mean you can't have short-term reversals. In fact, in September, oftentimes, Bitcoin dominance does at least temporarily reverse course from whatever direction it was previously going. So, for instance, if you look previously in the months of September, you can see here is an example where in September, Bitcoin dominance reversed course, but then it still went down a little bit more a couple months later. Also, in 2021, you can see that Bitcoin dominance reversed course in September, but then it still went a little bit lower by the end of the year. Sometimes when Bitcoin dominance goes into September, it can mark a longer term reversal, but that's not always the case, right? You can see it's not always the case, even though it can often be a sign that the market is going to change direction relatively soon. So it is possible that Bitcoin dominance does start to reverse relatively soon. Now, it could happen as early as later on this month. It might take until the end of the year for Bitcoin dominance to more durably reverse. My guess is that Bitcoin dominance tops sometime between, September and December. That is my best guess. Again, I could absolutely be wrong about that, but if you wanted me to guess, I would say sometime between September and December. September, because oftentimes we do see Bitcoin dominance reverse in September. December, because there are times where Bitcoin dominance reverses in September, but then it then comes back down by the end of the year. So we've seen that happen a couple times. It could be the reverse this time, where it potentially does something like this, where it goes up a little bit, sets a new high, goes back down to the bull market support band, and then goes back up in November, December to go to 60%, and then reverses course, right? Something like that could theoretically happen. Now, if you were to look at the year to date, right? If we were to look at the year to date ROI of Bitcoin dominance without stablecoins, which is arguably the better way to look at it, dominance without stablecoins, one of the things you'll notice here is that, well, first of all, what year do you compare it to? If you are in the if you're in the halving camp, right? If you think this plays out, Bitcoin dominance plays out like the halving, then whatever you're smoking, I'd like some, because so far this year, Bitcoin dominance has not been playing out like the halving year, right? It's been more so playing out like 2019, right? Like 2019, where Bitcoin dominance generally trends higher. Now, in 2019, Bitcoin dominance did top in September. Now, look closely at this, right? Do you see how there's these series, like over here, there was this series of like Bitcoin dominance sort of tapping this ceiling, and then it broke through, and then that ended up being the top. I almost wonder if something similar is going to happen again, where it finally breaks through, and then that ends up being the top, whenever that may be. Of course, you could argue the top is in, but generally thinking, if alt Bitcoin pairs and ETH Bitcoin plays out like it has in prior cycles, then it is still possible for Bitcoin dominance to go just a bit higher. One of the last things I said in my last video on Bitcoin dominance was that, the August to September timeframe was going to be sort of the area of weakness for Bitcoin dominance. It could even extend into October. What's fascinating is that despite the fact that in prior halving years, this was the area of weakness, this time it's actually kept Bitcoin dominance relatively flat. So you could argue, had this not been a seasonally weaker time for dominance, it would have gone higher. But because it's a seasonally weaker time, it's kept Bitcoin dominance relatively flat for the last couple of months. However, if you look at prior halving years, you can see that Bitcoin dominance went up in Q4. If you look at 2019, you can see that starting in about mid-November or so, Bitcoin dominance started to go back up, and it more or less set kind of like a double top, if you will. So I think there is a case to be made that Bitcoin dominance could still theoretically go to 60%. That does not mean it can't ever check back in with the bull market support band. That is currently at around 56%. The prior sort of breakout area right here was just north of 56%. So it's always possible that Bitcoin dominance goes back and checks in with that level. But I do think that these overall trends do remain intact. Now, when thinking about Bitcoin dominance, it makes sense to look at some of the metrics that obviously contribute to it: ETH Bitcoin and alt Bitcoin pairs. For alt Bitcoin pairs, you could argue that the bull market support band is now at the prior support level. Some of the times when a certain index or metric looks like it's going to go to a certain level. In this case, if it looks like alt Bitcoin pairs are going to go to 0.25, which is what I generally think, because I do believe altcoins are oscillators at best, some of the times a lot of people will struggle to believe that view. And so they'll actively fight it with their money, right? Like with their investments, they will not buy into that view. Even if they can look at the chart and see that alt Bitcoin pairs have generally been trending down for years, they will simply not believe it. Some of the times, in order for it to actually happen, this moving average, right, the bull market support band, the 20-week SMA and or the 21-week EMA, it has to come back down to the level that was previously support to actually kick the market to where it needs to go. So in this case, point 0.4 was the level that alt Bitcoin pairs held support at for about a year or so, right? From June of 2023 until June of 2024. And then they capitulated. They came back above it. It was a fake out. And now they're coming back up to point 0.4 again. But the difference this time is that point 0.4 happens to correspond to where the bull market support band is, right? So it's actually at point 0.4 for both the 20-week SMA and the 21-week EMA. So perhaps what happens some of the times is, there's a lot of stubbornness that goes on over here, and people actively try to fight that trend. But then when push comes to shove, when the bull market support band meets that prior support that's turned resistance, it can finally perhaps kick them down to where I ultimately think they're going to go. One of the interesting things about this cycle so far is that it's kind of the reverse of last cycle, in the sense that ETH Bitcoin has arguably already taken a majority of the drop that I would have expected. My thinking with ETH Bitcoin is that it bottoms between 0.03 to 0.04. It's possible that ETH Bitcoin bottoms this month. And in fact, at this point, with the information that I have, I would say it's more likely than not that ETH Bitcoin bottoms out relatively soon. I think that 0.04 is the best case scenario for a bottom, but I also think it's certainly possible that ETH Bitcoin capitulates sub 0.04 for at least a few days, maybe a little bit longer than that. If you look at the last couple of cycles, you'll notice that after ETH Bitcoin broke support durably, it trended down for a couple of months after that, right? A couple of months after that. This was about, 10 weeks or so. And then here in 2019, it was about 8 weeks. So if you look at it so far this cycle, since durably breaking support, it's been about 7 weeks. Now, what's interesting about that is you can see that the last two times that ETH Bitcoin capitulated, in 2016 and in 2019, it took 8 to 10 weeks. So about 2 months, maybe, somewhere around that 2 to 2.5 month threshold. What's interesting is that the Fed is likely about to cut interest rates. Now, if you look at market expectations, the market currently thinks they're going to cut 25 basis points, although the odds of a 50 basis point rate cut have gone up substantially. The reason why that might be important is because last cycle, when ETH Bitcoin bottomed, it was actually after the Fed had cut 50 basis points. When the Fed cut 25 basis points, ETH Bitcoin still went down, but it was after the next 25 basis point rate cut that ETH Bitcoin actually bottomed out. So there does exist a scenario where ETH Bitcoin bottoms out within the next couple of weeks if the Fed gets more aggressive with their rate cuts. Furthermore, we also know that ETH Bitcoin bottomed out when the Fed actually shifted to lowering their assets or to increasing assets on their balance sheet. So if you look here, the blue line, that's exactly where ETH Bitcoin bottomed out last cycle. Now, I don't know what the Fed's going to do next week. I don't know if they're going to pivot or not, but I will say ETH Bitcoin is getting relatively close to a bottom. I could see it going below 0.04 for a little while, but I don't think it would stay there very long. The longest I think it would probably stay there could be, say, something like this, where it bounces down there, goes back up to the 20-week SMA, and then comes back down, and then breaks above it the following year. So you could see it do something like this, right, where it goes sub 0.04, bounces back up to the bull market support band, comes back down for a double bottom, and then goes up in 2025. Something like that could theoretically happen. Now, what's interesting, though, is that it looks like ETH Bitcoin could potentially be closer to a bottom than alt Bitcoin pairs. So one of the ways this could theoretically work out is that on the first drop to, around 0.04 or even sub 0.04, it doesn't take alt Bitcoin pairs with it. But maybe on the second drop, if it does that later this year, say in December, perhaps that could be finally taking alt Bitcoin pairs down to where I ultimately think they need to go. As I've said previously, you may wonder, why do I say alt Bitcoin pairs are oscillators at best? The reason is because, technically speaking, and I said this last time too, technically speaking, which is the only thing that matters, you have, with alt Bitcoin pairs, right, you have lower highs and lower lows, right? You could even draw a parallel channel and sort of connect these dots and say, all right, technically those are lower highs and lower lows. And you could even draw price labels on here, right? 1.07, 0.97. Here's 0.26, 0.25, 0.24, and this even wicked below it all the way down here. But if you want to take the glass half full approach, instead of saying they're bleeding, you could argue that they are oscillators, where this move right here and this move down here are just deviations from an overall trend. But if that's the case, then alt Bitcoin pairs theoretically still need to take this plunge at some point, probably before the end of the year. So I think there is still a good case to be made that alt Bitcoin pairs will eventually get this move to the downside. It's hard to say exactly when it's going to occur. There always could be a scenario where it goes down by the end of the year. If you connect the dots from like the last cycle, 2018, 2019 to 2020, you can see that it basically tagged this trend line 3 times, and then the third tag of the trend line ended up being the bottom. We know that this interest rate cycle, this business cycle, has taken a little bit longer. And if you connect the dots again, right, 1, 2, and 3, the third tag of the trend line might actually occur by the end of the year. And coincidentally, if you look at this trend line where you connect the dots, it hits 0.25 in Q4, which is exactly what I've said could be the ultimate outcome, alt Bitcoin pairs capitulating before the end of the year. So I think there is a case to be made that alt Bitcoin pairs will simply get rejected at 0.4, or they could still wick a little bit above it, but I ultimately think they will get rejected and they will come back down here to the range lows before the end of the year. One of the things that you have to consider is what's causing this to go down, and arguably one of the main things is net liquidity. So if you look at the global net liquidity approximation, you will see that it has in fact been putting in lower highs and lower lows for a while. And actually, if you overlay this chart, if you overlay it with alt Bitcoin pairs, you can actually pretty clearly see that alt Bitcoin pairs broke down, sort of a fake out, right at the same time that net liquidity was sort of having a fake breakdown, right? You see that? And then net liquidity came back up, and so too have alt Bitcoin pairs. But if net liquidity gets rejected here, then it could cause out alt Bitcoin pairs to finally take the plunge. Now, what would cause them to get rejected? Well, in order to understand that, what makes up net liquidity? It's not just the balance sheet of the Fed, which has been going down, but it's also the dollar. If you're converting balance sheets of other central banks to US dollars, obviously the DXY is important to ultimately track. But one of the things about the DXY that's important is that it's actually been tracking the 10-year yield relatively closely. But the 10-year yield has been going down, so the dollar has been going down. So one of the things, though, to think about here, if you overlay the dollar with the 10-year yield, you'll see they actually track quite closely. So is there a chance that the 10-year bounces after the first rate cut? We actually saw some of that stuff happen in Europe a few months ago. We saw some of the long end of the yield curve stuff going up after they started to cut. That doesn't mean it's durably going up, but one of the things to consider with the 10-year yield is it actually topped out the last 2 years in late October. So there does always exist a scenario where it bounces back up for, a lower high, right? I mean, a lower high. So this one was April, but if you look at this was October, right? October of 2022, October of 2023. So could you get another October rally in the 10-year yield? One of the interesting things about the yields is if you look at the 2-year yields, they're actually back down to sort of the range low from March of 2023. So, if on the other side of rate cuts, the economy does not immediately collapse into a recession, then it might mean that the 2-year yield is actually undervalued, and perhaps it goes back up to the bull market support band and then gets rejected from there, and then finally breaks support later on this year or early next year. There's always a chance that that happens. Now, the problem with that for altcoins is if yields bounce, then it means net liquidity or if yields bounce, then the idea would be that the dollar bounces, and if the dollar bounces, then the idea would be that net liquidity drops, and if net liquidity drops, it means alt Bitcoin pairs go down. A lot of people do like to make this comparison to the 2016 cycle, which I am somewhat on board with parts of that comparison, even though I haven't been on board with the Bitcoin dominant side of that comparison. But if you are in the 2016 camp, you should know that it was actually right around August, September, where the dollar basically had put in a higher low, right? And then as you got out into October, November, December, Q4, that's when the dollar actually surged a pretty large amount. So if the dollar does not actually break down here and it surges back up, then what it would mean is that it would mean that net liquidity goes back down, right? So again, overlaying net liquidity here, net liquidity right now is essentially potentially here putting in another lower high. Now, if net liquidity gets rejected and goes back down, then that might be exactly what alt Bitcoin pairs need to get rejected by their bull market support band and ultimately go down here to the range lows. This would represent a correction by alt Bitcoin pairs of approximately 36%. Now, I should say, not all alt Bitcoin pairs have to follow this path. It could be that a few of the higher market cap altcoins are more responsible for this drop than some of the lower market cap altcoins. There's always a chance that happens. Speaking of lower market cap altcoins, it's always useful to go check in with Others Bitcoin. Others Bitcoin has been following this path that we outlined long ago, where it essentially fades back down to the range low, it rallies, it gets a pullback, rallies again, and then a more substantial pullback. Same thing happened over here in May of 2019. You can see that Others Bitcoin came down, it swept the low, it rallied a little bit, another pullback, rallied up to the bull market support band, rejection right before rate cuts, all the way back down here. Same thing happened in 2022, 2023. You have a low, you sweep the low, you get a move up, you get a pullback, you go up to the bull market support band, you get rejected, and then you go down. Set the low, sweep the low, get a little rally, get a pullback, get another rally, potentially up to the bull market support band, and then it potentially could break that support sometime later on this year. Last cycle, we actually saw Others Bitcoin drop 60%, rally 60%, and then drop 60% after rate cuts. If it does the same thing this cycle, you can see that Others Bitcoin dropped 60%, rallied 60%, and it's already dropped 40%. So if it drops 60%, that means it could in fact go just a bit lower. If it did that, you might argue similarly as alt Bitcoin pairs, higher market cap stuff, that it could be sort of like a third tag of this trend line that actually ultimately marks the bottom. So if you were to draw sort of an arrow here, right, you have your first tag, your second tag of the trend line, and then your third. Same thing could be happening here, 1, 2, and 3. That ultimately could send Bitcoin dominance to 60%, which is still going to be my base case. Now, again, it's possible that ETH Bitcoin bottoms out soon. Like, I'm not saying that ETH Bitcoin has to go down until the end of the year. In fact, right now, I would say it's more likely that ETH Bitcoin bottoms out within the next few weeks. But that doesn't mean that alt Bitcoin pairs bottom out within the next few weeks. It could be that ETH Bitcoin gets a bounce, and then later on, after getting that bounce, it could be that ETH Bitcoin comes back down in December to set a double bottom, and that might be when alt Bitcoin pairs finally get that final collapse. So that's generally what I think right now about Bitcoin dominance. I wouldn't be that surprised to see it sort of go into the 58% range somewhat soon. Could always see a pullback after that. but ultimately speaking, I do think Bitcoin dominance is likely going to top out this year. The first couple of weeks of January at the absolute latest, but I don't think it's going to take that long. That's my general thinking on this whole thing. And then the other thing too with Bitcoin USD, as it rallies, it breaks alt Bitcoin pairs down, right? It's doing the same thing. By the way, it's been going through a pattern if you haven't been noticing it, where it goes up for 2 weeks and then down for 2 weeks and then up for 2 weeks. These are 2 week candles and then down for 2 weeks. And now we're just sort of in the up for 2 weeks phase, which is interesting because Bitcoin also rallied into rate cuts last cycle, and the rate cut will occur next week. So then the week after the week that we get rate cuts will be their next 2 week candle. And that's actually last cycle. We saw Bitcoin USD show a little bit of weakness after that first rate cut. So the first rate cut back over here occurred, basically the last week of July, right? Somewhere over here. So you can see Bitcoin sort of rallied into it and then it came back down. So always a possibility this stuff is playing out exactly like last cycle. And I just want to, I want everyone to be aware of that. I do think the key here is to watch ETH Bitcoin. It looks like it's about to enter into final capitulation. So I wouldn't be that surprised to see it, go just a bit lower, reach final capitulation, and then get some form of a bounce. One of the interesting things, by the way, you guys remember the comparison that we made January, February, and May. January, February, and May. This is 2019, this is 2024. But if you look at a price label of the low before the May 2019 bounce, it was 0.024. If you look at the same thing for this cycle, it was 0.044. And then the low actually ended up being 0.016. If it ends up following that same pattern and the low is 0.036, the reason why 0.036 is interesting is because 0.036 is right around that level that ETH Bitcoin topped out at in 2016, right? So I just find it interesting how all that stuff is generally lining up. So I would say it makes sense to be on the alert for a potential ETH Bitcoin bottom sometime the next couple of weeks or so, potentially even this week or next week. Alt Bitcoin pairs to me still look like they have a ways to go down, but it might take until the end of the year for everyone to actually start believing that. And then one of the interesting things about it, as I said previously, is that when people don't believe, some of the times it just makes the market get relatively stagnant for a while, like others, like alt Bitcoin pairs have been. But then after you give the bull market support band long enough to catch back up to prior support that's turned resistance, that might be what the market needs to ultimately get alt Bitcoin pairs rejected here and then go down into those rate cuts. Remember last cycle, if you look at weekly candles, alt Bitcoin pairs were right around here around the first rate cut. And you can see right after the rate cut, alt Bitcoin pairs went down. Okay. So it is taking longer this time, right? Absolutely. It's taking until the halving year as opposed to the pre-halving year. But again, that's probably just because rate cuts took longer this cycle to get to than it did last cycle. But I ultimately am going to stand by this view that by the end of the year, alt Bitcoin pairs will be down here at 0.25. ETH Bitcoin will likely bottom out between 0.03 to 0.04. And then Bitcoin dominance should hit approximately 60%. And then next year, Bitcoin dominance will likely spend most of the year going down just after everyone finally gave up on all of their alt season calls. So those are my views about Bitcoin dominance. I will continue to provide updates to it, but it's hard to do it every single day or every single week, these longer Bitcoin dominance videos, because just not a whole lot happens, right? I mean, you can see over the last month, Bitcoin dominance hasn't really done anything. And I make these videos knowing full well that if ETH Bitcoin bottoms out within the next couple of weeks, there could be a short-term pullback on Bitcoin dominance, even if all Bitcoin pairs are breaking down, because ETH represents a much larger percentage of the market cap. So again, it could be one of those things where the path is like this, where it goes up a little bit, down, and then up again into December, top at 60%, and then go down. I would not be surprised at all if that is the direction that it ultimately goes. In fact, I might argue it's the more likely direction, where ETH Bitcoin bottoms out soon. Everyone laughs at it because they're like, oh, look at ETH Bitcoin, and then they're sort of bragging about their altcoin. And then later on, they see what's up and they see, hey, maybe your altcoin isn't any better than ETH, and perhaps you're living off in la la land thinking that it is. So That's the way I think the market's gonna go. I have given ETH Bitcoin a hard time over the last 3 years. I don't make any apologies for it. I think my view is right. I think a lot of people just had a hard time showing patience to actually watching it play out. Now I think it's time for ETH Bitcoin to bottom out here relatively soon between 0.03 to 0.04. The altcoin degens will laugh at it, and then they'll find out what's up in Q4 of 2024. Thank you guys for tuning in. Hopefully we'll see Bitcoin dominance to 60% soon. I'll see you guys next time. Bye.